Having financial security into retirement may be one of the most important questions when it comes to our spending and saving. And as we live longer, we may need to adjust what that number is. But there may be some good news about how much we need and what we'll spend as we age. Fred Vetesse is former chief actuary at Morneau Shepell and author of Retirement Income for Life. Fred, great to have you with us.
Hi.
So one of the pieces of the puzzle here that most of us are aware of is we don't save enough. Everybody worries, have they saved enough for retirement? Is there some truth to that? Do we need to worry that Canadians aren't setting aside what they should, given that we're living longer than we formerly did?
It'll become increasingly true as time goes by. The baby boomers in general have done pretty well. But anyone younger than 50 is going to be more hard-pressed to do as well, because they're not going to they won't have the same kind of housing wealth accumulating over time as we did, and as I did, and the returns on investments probably won't be as high as they used to be. On top of that, we're also living longer. So for all those kinds of reasons, it'll be more difficult to save enough in the future.
You've also
which is all the more reason as
Go ahead.
Which is all the more reason as to why we ought to be deferring our Canada pension plan until age 70, because it ends up being that much more than if we started it at 65. Something,
of course, that it's been played around with to try to move the retirement age in the country later. Politically, it's a tough one. And, of course, because the boomers have had such a big influence politically, it may be hard to do. The other big generation, of course, almost as big really now, millennials coming up behind, do they have the political clout to actually make that kind of change happen?
Well, you mean the change in retirement age?
Yes.
Like a later retirement age? It is probably going to happen eventually, simply because it's happened in virtually every other developed country. So it's going to happen here as well. In most countries, including the United States, by the way, have increased their normal retirement age for Social Security purposes to 67 or 68. Some are even talking about raising it beyond that. So what Stephen Harper suggested or was going to put in place a few years ago was not out of the ordinary by any stretch.
Some of the work you've also done over time showed that many retirees actually have more than they need. They spend less than they think. Do you think that will continue to be true, or as we live longer and our medical conditions rack up, that will be less true over time?
It's going to be less true in general, but there's always going to be a pretty large percentage of the population that will save too much, simply because they don't know exactly how much they ought to be saving. And so we tend to err on the side of caution. That's just who we are.
What we worry, of course, when we see, Fred, the number of workers, the ratio of workers to retirees is shrinking and shrinking as we look down the road. Do we need to worry that we can't afford all these retirees, and maybe, this is, I know, a terrible thing to suggest, but maybe people get less than they think they were going to get in pensions that they've paid into?
Let's take those two questions separately. In terms of whether or not we have to worry about whether we can afford to retire, or something is going to have to happen. We used to have over 6 workers per retiree back in the 1960s. It's now shrunk to about 4 workers per retiree. And ultimately, in another 20, 25 years, it'll actually bottom out at about 2.2 workers per retiree. So that's only one of the pieces in this puzzle. The other piece is, are we actually getting more efficient as a society in terms of producing goods? In terms of getting things done, do we just not need to have as many work hours in order to have the same kind of lifestyle? Mm-hmm. So will that, for example, deep learning, AI, will that actually change our lives and actually negate that factor? So we'll have to see if that ends up happening. But otherwise, we will have fewer workers per retiree. There's no question about that. But I'm not worried about the Canada pension plan at all. We may have to worry a little bit about old age security and whether we can keep on affording that, because that's just paid out of government general revenues. We're not actually funding that like we are with the Canada pension plan.
So good to have you, Fred. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Frederick Vetesse is a former chief actuary at Morneau Shepell, author of many books, including Retirement Income for Life. Time for the takeaway and great expectations. A much reported figure in recent years has to do with just how much money is expected to transfer from one generation to the next over the coming decade or two. $1 trillion is one accepted figure, that being the amount that baby boomers will bequeath to their heirs, both during their lifetime and after their death. It's a big number, and one that has the potential to make a big difference in our economy. As passive savings moves into the hands of people still in the consumption phase of life, it will have a positive effect on the Canadian economy, and it will help reverse one of the worst things about old people economically, which is their habit of reduced spending. Given that younger generations have some disadvantages relative to their parents, including a higher cost of living, less stable sources of wage and income, and a markedly lower savings rate, this wealth transfer is one they will be extremely happy to see. But it's not without its complications. For one thing, not everyone will get it. It goes without saying that some parents and grandparents are poorer than others. So the gift of inheritance will be uneven, and in some cases make inequality a multi-generational affair. And then there's the assumption that this amount will even come to pass. Given that we're living longer, but tend to do so with at least one, if not two, chronic medical conditions, it's reasonable to think we may spend more on ourselves as we age. Different choices around what kind of conditions we're willing to live in may change how much we leave behind. And then there's the little problem of how governments may treat seniors going forward. It could be that necessity forces them to change the terms of, say, pensions, getting rid of inflation indexing in order to help meet what will be increasingly expensive obligations. My takeaway? No question, some Gen Xers and their kids have a windfall coming their way. But for others, counting on an inheritance that never comes could be a painful experience. That's Taking Stock for this week. I'm Amanda Lang. Thanks for being with us.